Hello, this is Socialist Lynx. Today we're going to be talking about Cuba and the current protests right now of Cuba right now, as well as the fact on a brief history and a brief overview of the analysis of the Cuban Revolution, and in which how we got here and what we can learn from the Cuban Revolution and how we can basically transfer it to here today. If you do not know, the Cuba currently right now is practically having an ongoing revolutionary situation at this point. There are workers in protest right now against the ongoing U.S. embargoes in the United States, from the United States to Cuba, that is hindering a lot of the actual developments for better vaccines and better responses to COVID, with the new arrivals of variants of COVID, such as the Delta variant, that is currently having the Cuban people very mad at the Cuban government for essentially having to basically abide to what the United States is doing and abide to the U.S. sanctions, but also for the Cuban government and for the Cuban people in having to deal with a lot of the U.S. sanctions right now and deal with the U.S. embargoes that is currently massively damaging the Cuban people and the Cuban government and Cuban economy. That is very much detrimental right now, when we are in a period of COVID-19 and when there is still a new variant that has now been launched that it seems to not be going away anytime soon, especially in Cuba, and will only get worse in Cuba if the United States continues its embargo and its increasement of embargoes as well. Many of the protests right now, entirely in Cuba, contrary to conservative belief, is that it is actually a protest to continue the Cuban Revolution and to continue the very things that Castro has said against the Batista government, which was a U.S.-backed government, in order to sustain the interests of the U.S. bourgeoisie through the labor of the Cuban proletarians within Cuba. Not to mention on how there was itself a Cuban bourgeoisie that was instrumental and was in direct hand with the U.S. that essentially profited massively out of the work and out of the labor and out of the absolute problems of the Batista government. But there are indeed protests, small pockets of protests, that are indeed against the Cuban government. Some by abiding to the conservative belief that the U.S. is better than Cuba, although it's very small. But that also protests essentially against the United States and the Cuban state, which I think is possibly the most preferable one of the movements of the workers that were able to be conscious about the problems of the United States and Cuba, both being bourgeois states and both being problems towards the working class, and both essentially selling out to the working class as well, and essentially implementing laws and policies that would essentially hurt the working class, as well as the fact profit from the labor that they essentially produce when they essentially perform labor time, performing to the workday, producing commodities. So, what has happened, and how did Cuba itself even become capitalist? Well, we have to essentially go back to the Cuban Revolution of 1956. Under Cuba, there was a rule of government called the Batista government. They were a bureaucratic government that was backed up by the United States and essentially was and overthrew a previous government via coup from support by the U.S. in order to suppress many of the policies, social democratic policies that was implemented in Cuba that the United States really did not like, nationalizing the economy of Cuba. Thus they employed a coup in order to have a country that served the interests of the United States, and any rebelling and any dissenters against this would essentially be fought against. One of these people was Fidel Castro, and as well as many others, as well a part of the July 26 movement. To actually cite Socialist Party USA in their panel by William Stodden, a U.S. political analysis that is specialized into the Cuban studies and into the Cuban Revolution and the July 26 movement, where he says the following.
To our right, Fidel Castro, Abel Santamaria, and Aide Santamaria. These two individuals were brother and sister, and they were instrumental working with Fidel Castro in organizing the July 26 movement. And this immediately followed the overthrow of the Cuban Republican government in 1952 by Fulgencio Batista, who was a colonel at the time, I believe. And he essentially canceled legislative and presidential elections in 1952 because it looked like he and his party would lose to the party that Fidel Castro was associated with, which is known as the Ortodoxo Party. Following that coup, he established himself as the, essentially the authoritarian dictator with the blessing of the United States and also corporate American interests to basically run the country as a fiefdom of the United States. He received a lot of help from ITT, for example, with International Telegraph and Telephone. The story about him receiving a gold telephone from them was, as a matter of fact, true. He also had the support of a number of very large sugar interests, as well as Bacardi rum. So if you drink Bacardi, you're drinking Cuban rum that has subsequently fled out of Cuba and now operates out of Puerto Rico. They took the patents with them after Castro took over. In 1952, these individuals, as well as several other important characters, began organizing a resistance to the Batista regime. They started in 1952, but they just called themselves the movement at the time. Obviously, the 26th of July, it hadn't happened yet, so they just called themselves the movement or some other name. But it was a clandestine organization where they were talking about acquiring weapons, acquiring training, acquiring propaganda and money to have an armed resistance to the Batista regime. As I mentioned, it was organized to oppose that coup. And over the next year, they started organizing training, putting out propaganda and gathering money and weapons. And their whole goal was to oppose the Batista regime. They were one of a number of groups that were operating within Cuba at the time. They weren't probably the most important. They were a very small group of people, but Fidel Castro already sort of had a reputation as a supporter of a fellow named Eduardo Chibas. And Chibas very famously was a radio announcer who shot himself to death on the radio in protest of the Batista regime. This,
as seen there, the entirety of the movement originated from resentment against the Batista government and the entire desires to fight against the Batista government as a reaction back to these old social democratic formats of the Cuban policies that essentially were implemented during this time. In the video, it was mentioned of the Monica Barracks, where many of the actually even original leaders of the movement, such as Abigail Santamena, was actually shot to death during that time period, which was later said in the video. The link of the description of the video shall be provided as a source into the description. So if you seek to find that video, the video is there for you to watch it. It is pretty good. Anyways, to move on. Cuba entirely then, Fidel Castro and many of the people part of the movement at the time ended up having to essentially be exiled and had to flee out of Cuba into Mexico. This is around the same time Che Guevara decided to go on a traveling side around South America and all of Latin America as well to basically help with patients that essentially need his help. This included within Nicaragua, where many of the banana companies in the United States was massively exploiting workers and essentially having private property that did not have access for the people to get access to property that they essentially needed in order to survive during the time. And when there was a land reform being provided into a Nicaraguan government, the United States quickly overthrew the government via coup and installed another government, just like how they did with Batista in Cuba. Thus, Guevara had to flee out of Nicaragua and to go to Mexico to get out of the violence, and where he actually somewhat started essentially sympathizing with leftist sympathies, and this is around the time that he met Fidel Castro in Mexico. The movement, though, as mentioned in the video, was not the only resistance movement in Cuba at the time. There was actually a Trotskyist organization, and there was quite a lot of Trotskyist influence within Cuba that was actually against the Batista government, and essentially desired not necessarily merely just a reinstation of the Orthodox Party within Cuba to be reinstated in power in order for then the state to essentially have more influence into the market economy, but now rather the actual abolition of the market entirely and the abolition of commodity production within Cuba at the time, so that way there can actually be a full-on worker state, as well as the abolition of the standing army, the police force entirely, based on the control of the working class themselves, and for Soviets to be instituted as the governing organs of the worker state and the new state, where the workers essentially have direct control over policy and elect leaders entirely with recallable elections that they can recall if the working class essentially seeks to do so via mass majority vote on all policies, on all elections of leaders and policies, and recalling those said leaders that they are elected. Unlike the movement, they essentially did not seek to create a guerrilla army like what Fidel Castro and Che Guevara would later do. Rather, that they seek to actually unite the working class into an organization that they controlled, rather than actually having a guerrilla standing army with unelected officers and unelected generals fighting against the bourgeois state for the working class without the actual consolidation or without the direct power of workers to the guerrilla movement itself, to the guerrilla army. Regardless, Fidel Castro recruited Che Guevara into the movement while in Mexico, and together they ended up working together and planning for quite a long time, and ended up actually reading a lot more into revolutionary policies and actually into actually a synthesis between revolutionary action, both in the Second International and into the Third International as well, into those actions, and thus implemented those theories into Cuba once they returned. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara returned to Cuba and thus basically created the guerrilla army, which then became the July 26 movement, entirely, which was a guerrilla force of armies, not necessarily now merely a broad movement of workers, but now essentially changing up from Fidel Castro being the commander and head of the entire army itself, and Che Guevara being one of the appointed generals that created a communist faction within the July 26 movement, and try to basically create proletarian militias, but was quickly shut down by Fidel Castro, and thus officers and generals being appointed by Fidel Castro himself in order to carry out armed action against the Batista government. The following Trotskyist organizations were the Bolshevik Leninist Party and the Revolutionary Worker Party, or commonly known as the Partido Bolchevique Leninista y Partido Obrero Revolucionario. And these entire parties were actually very much detrimental into a revolution taking place within the 1930s to fight against the Batista government and the United States government, and it continued on during this time period when the July 26 movement ended up taking place. The most common about this was actually the Revolutionary Worker Party that essentially was very much detrimental within the Cuban Revolution. As of the way as Gary Andrew in his great work Dissident Cuban Communism, The Case for Trotskyism, 1932 to 1965, which is a great detailed work actually about the Cuban Revolution and the entire contribution of Trotskyists within Cuba, says, after the triumph of the revolution, although no formally constituted Trotskyist organization existed in Cuba, a core former PBL and POR members continued to agitate within the petty bourgeois nationalist milieu of the apartment, attempted to strengthen the proletarian base and viewing revolutionary institutions. This perspective was loosely working within the broad revolutionary continuity, exemplified by the intervention of Ebretio Feria Acosta in the Movimiento de Supresión del Barrio Gobernanta, a spontaneous community-based organization of a forerunner of the state-sponsored Committees for Defense of the Revolution, the CDR. as one of the principals of the leaders of the Feria, was involved in the initiating of the literacy campaign of the Guantanamo, as well as the collection of money of the agrarian projects and the organization of guards of public buildings. Having lost contact with the Fourth International in the late 40s and the early 1950s, relations of the international Trotskyist movement were reestablished in 1959 after the arrival of Laga Scorbino, a Uruguayan representative of the Latin American Bureau of the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, headed by Juan Posadas. As described in Section 2.4, the Trotskyist groups adhering to the International Secretariat, in contrast to those affiliated with the International Committee, firmly supported the Pablo White thesis of the various Stalinist and national liberation movements that were agencies of the Socialist Revolution. Given such a soft line across class forces, unsurprising the Scarpa's initial relations, contact with the militants of the Movimiento 26 de Julio in 1959 were reportedly characterized as the frontal spirit. She was given the access of the radio and television. It was during such broadcasts that she made the public call for Cuban Trotskyists for a meeting. However, although her presence speeded the process for reorganizing the Trotskyist Party in Cuba, according to the various testimonies, it was the initiative of the Cuban Trotskyists themselves, the Trotskyist Party, that was reconstituted early. And during this time period as well, that is mentioned in the book and various other books, that actually the Cuban Trotskyists ended up actually getting in contact with Che Guevara as entirely, and actually even talked with him, seeing his efforts into creating proletarian militias within Cuba, but was quickly shut down by Fidel Castro. Ended up actually talking with them, Thus, what Fidel did, he literally destroyed the ability for workers to self-emancipate, and even admitted that the July 26 movement was mostly a social democratic movement, that he only claimed to be communist so that way he can get support from Nikita Khrushchev after the overthrow of the US-backed regime. There were workers in the streets, and as well as there was a communist faction in Cuba that led by Che Guevara. But the thing is, Che Guevara could have simply joined among the workers and spread class political consciousness to the proletariat of Cuba that were protesting in Havana, rather than trying to join a standing army that would substitute over the proletariat and overthrow the government by themselves. This is what the POR essentially try to critique of Che Guevara and try to ask Guevara and try to do so while working well entirely to get to the self-emancipation of the proletariat. Guevara set aside this and went on to join the army. He tried to make proletarian militias, of course, but then was shut down by Castro, who said, even in his own words, the masses are not able to get to the fight from themselves. They need a substitute over them, even without them knowing it. And after the overthrow of Batista, so around this time, Che Guevara essentially had essentially correspondence with the Cuban Trotskyists and did listen to them. However, Castro essentially ignored this and tried to basically say that the Trotskyists were perfectionists and that they try to had a perfect revolution in dark times. When in reality, the ability in order to essentially spread political consciousness in the spontaneous movements of the working class was indeed available at the time and was a viable option with the given material conditions. Thus, even in his own critiques, the critiques itself wasn't really substantiable, and the very premise of his entire criticism, was not very accurate. To cite Joseph Hansen, who actually ended up supporting Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement, despite the fact of the critiques of the Cuban Trotskyists, and actually I would say the correct critiques of the Cuban Trotskyists during the time, said, on the characterization of the state, we think the Cuban people are now have a workers' state, and that the Cuban Trotskyists agree on this, and the key leaders of the revolution, they often admitted, certainly began as a petty bourgeois. Despite the background, Castro and his collaborations did not hesitate to nationalize industry and introduce a planned economy and many others proletarian measures that completely, to their credit, the government established whatever most certainly represents the interests of the workers today. Do I believe that the Cuba is a worker state? No. However, one thing that is actually said here is that the Cuban Trotskyists were indeed involved within the revolution, and that it was indeed there. We need to take what Joseph Hansen says here very critically. That's one thing we have to understand. Even with the nationalization of the economy, that only just meant that the more domination of the state essentially had more control into the state itself and into the commodity production itself. And the Cuban Trotskyists actually called for the planned economy and not really Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro never really implemented planned economy, never really even talked about it in much of his works. How the majority of the people that did talk about the planned economy was the Worker Revolutionary Party. The July 26th movement, however, did indeed take place, and did indeed take place through a guerrilla movement, and did indeed take place through a guerrilla force that would essentially substitute over workers and would make decisions over the working class that would actually be a hindrance against working class struggle, and actually be an implementation of the reinstitution of the market within Cuba at the time. After the overthrow of Batista, workers ended up getting mad that there was still commodity production and markets in Cuba. However, they didn't, and how they didn't have direct control over the state in their own class power to elect leaders and elect policy as well, and recall elections through the mass democratic vote. They were heavily organized into the POR. In Cuba at the time. Castro responded in his power that wasn't elected in, and seized power for himself and other close allies, appoint him as advisors. Also, a council that appointed of these appointed representatives responded with a shoot down against the rabid dog workers, as he said, and arrested many workers and communists and put them into laboring detention centers. As Gary Andrew would say in Descendant of Cuban Communism, The Case for Trotskyism, 1932-1965, at this relatively early stage of the revolution, through the PSP, cadres were already occupying the immediate positions of the institutions of the revolutionary government and capitalizing on Fidel Castro's calls for unity slates and trade unions. Their political position was still of the right of the Fidelista revolutionary leadership. As such, the PSP attempted to discredit the small revolutionary left-wing voice of the no-sense sanctioned revolutionary leadership itself. Instead, it reflected on the official communist long history of the combat with Trotskyism and the long-standing desire to suppress the development of representative institutions which display the degree of the class-based political autonomy. Furthermore, the PSP's accusations that the Trotskyists were provoking U.S. aggression by calling for a struggle against the native capitalist interest in the extension of nationalizations were rather weak when viewed in the light of the revolutionary leadership's subsequent turn against the U.S. property in Cuba. Shortly after the closure of the youth congresses, Fidel Castro, apparently against the expectations of the PSP, extended the round of expropriations and nationalizations so as to include two large-scale public services: the Cuban the Cuban telephone companies and the Cuban Electric Company. Yeah, private firms did indeed exist in Cuba. However, the PSP consolidated its influence in the institutions of the revolutionary government in 1961. Repression against the Trotskyists gained momentum, also turned into the more coordinated aspect of the heightening of political tension in Cuba when the state power was directly threatened by the United States. The first instance of attempted invasion in the Pilar Rayon in April of 1961 served as a catalyst for the first round systematic repression against the Trotskyists. The weeks following the victory of the revolutionary government over the U.S. government, trained invasion forces moves against the Trotskyists began seizure of the issue number of 10 of the POR newspaper Voz Proletariat. As a symbol of the commitment of the struggle of the right of the proletarian democracy within the revolution, between April of 1960 and the April of 1961, the Trotskyists had produced eight editions of the newspaper Voz Proletariat, in addition of the number pamphlets. The newspapers furthermore appeared into the name of the editors of the POR public addresses, first Jose Medina and the Lucanio Garcia and Guantanamo, and the Abrero Ferreira Ramirez at Monte Uno Dos in Havana. Openly cited, Voz Proletaria's existence was also made known of the revolutionary leadership, though of the direct means of posting copies of the offices of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. However, on the 26th of May 1961, before the May issue could be distributed, a group acting on behalf of the official of the PSP controlled Imprenta Nacional, the national printing office, and confiscated the entire point of the newspaper of the private printing works where it was prepared. Later on the same day, the PSP state functionaries acted on the orders of the Ministry of Labor, confiscated the printing plates of the editions of Trotsky's book, The Permanent Revolution. Gary Andrew, Dissident of Cuban Communism, The Case for Trotskyism, 1932 to 1965. Che Guevara actually saw this and actually kind of critiqued Fidel Castro for this, but however, the thing was too late. Guevara was too soft, and he did not see the revolutionary potential of the proletariat and had just by themselves. Thus, he ended up helping the Social Democrats make Cuba a very bureaucratic social democratic nation that then had turned state capitalist due to the workers' rebellion that seek to make an actual revolution. Soon, Che Guevara would then leave Cuba and go on to essentially learn from his mistakes and try to rally workers in Africa and rally workers as well in Bolivia. Ended up working with Trotskyists within Bolivia to overthrow the Bolivian government at the time. So Che Guevara ended up learning from his mistakes and ended up actually being quite Trotskyist within his works. However, the damage had already been done in Cuba, and Cuba ended up becoming a state capitalist country. As well as the fact Che Guevara's entire theories of the peasantry is, let's say, very simplistic and very, not based on a mode of production at all. So basically, we have to sum up the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution started out as actually a social democratic revolution entirely. That did indeed have a workers' movement and spontaneous action. However, those spontaneous actions of the working class and the actual abilities in which the working class can essentially have power based on their own power in order to create an actual vanguard party, or any vanguard party, or any political organization have any influence into the movement itself, was quickly despoted and essentially adopted actually guerrilla militias and guerrilla armies, specifically guerrilla standing army, in order to basically substitute over workers and carry out a armed rebellion, armed action for the working class in Cuba when the Cuban Proletariat was able to organize its own movements and able to organize its own mass action against Batista government, but was unable to essentially carry out in an effective manner due to the lack of class and political consciousness and the actual systems at hand, and the actual very system in which it led to this Batista government and led to this commodity production and led to the various problems at the time, as well as the fact the lack of centralization of the movement and demotivation that essentially occurred within the spontaneous action of the working class. Now, does this mean that we essentially are against the spontaneous action of the working class? No. However, this does mean that we essentially have to side with the working class in their own spontaneous action in order for there to be a dialectical relation between spontaneity and action itself. This is something that Lenin himself talked about quite a lot. But spontaneous action alone and spontaneity is not going to essentially create a revolution, rather a dialectical relation between as worker intellectuals talking with other workers entirely. So now we understand what happened in the Cuban Revolution and how Cuba essentially ended up becoming capitalist, and how actually the United States ended up using imperialism in order to justify its actions against Cuba. After Cuba itself ended up overthrowing a U.S.-backed government, which angered the United States, of course. So what's going on today, skipping over various other things that essentially end up happening, and what's happening today? Well, thousands took to the streets of Cuba to protest against the country's deepening and social economic crisis made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. The current conditions in Cuba are a direct result of U.S. imperialism sustained by bipartisan regime since the revolution that overthrew the Batista government on the island. Imposed in 1960, the embargo against Cuba was a retaliation of the nationalization of American-owned oil refineries without private compensation, but rather entire direct control from the state to the means of production, and with only minor free privatization within Cuba. In the recent years, the Trump administration furthermore placed 200 additional sanctions on the island under a campaign of maximum pressure aimed at further squeezing the island's economy, measures that have been continued by the Biden administration. It is ironic that the imperialism and political regime in the U.S. paints the fight one for freedom, that these are the same forces that supported the right-wing coup in Bolivia and continue to support the coup of plotters against the Juan Guaido in Venezuela, but also being the millions in the military aid of Israel every year to crush the Palestinians of further Israeli occupation. Back on to Cuba, however. Since 1992, Cuba has brought the demand of the ends of the U.S. embargo every year into the front of the UN, a motion that is approved annually with the overwhelming support of the international community, with the defeating exception of the U.S. and the closest ally, Israel. The non-binding request was, in fact, introduced against the 3 weeks ago and approved with the 184 votes in favor, 2 against the U.S. And Israel, and 3 abstentions of Colombia, Ukraine, and the United Arab Emirates. The Cuban bourgeois state reports that the blockade caused $9,157, $700 million in millions in losses to the country last year alone. As socialists, we need to strongly and universally and unequivocally reject any kind of U.S. imperialist intervention and demand an immediate end to the embargo and sanctions. Capitalism has nothing to offer in the island, as can be seen of the unrelenting poverty in Latin America, the mass rebellions in Chile and Colombia, and just as the examples of the failures of capitalism. As socialists in the belly of the imperialist beast, as in the United States, we must be ready to take to the streets of in the U.S. against any attempt to intervene in Cuba. The defense of the revolution, however, is not a defense of the Communist Party bureaucracy, which is enshrined into the state, but of gains made by the working class in the revolution to expropriate the capitalists. For decades, the bureaucracy has scrupulously maintained the privileges associated themselves with a foreign capital, opening up private investments and systematically degrading the nationalized economy, the monopoly of foreign trade, and other social gains. All the squatters diminishes the gains of the revolution, and the very substitution of actual potential for revolution itself. We defend the right to demonstration. We should defend the right of demonstration and worker organization for those who fight and to defend and who fight to defend the actual radicalism that happened in the Cuban Revolution, as well as the fact even continue the efforts of the Cuban Revolution to fight against the capitalist regime currently that was instituted by Fidel Castro himself. We continue for immediate release of the political prisoners that have taken place within Cuba at the time, and join the campaign for the immediate release of communists such as Frank Garcia and many of his comrades. The United States has to have hands off in Cuba and every oppressed country of the world, and we have to essentially stand against the imperialist actions of the United States. But we also must stand against the capitalist regime of Cuba and the entire actions that essentially took place within Cuba at the time. That is the reality of Cuba right now. It is a liberal democracy that has essentially instituted itself in order to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie entirely. The factions and the actual fight between Cuba and the United States is merely just a desire for one country to profit over another, with a still bourgeois class entirely that has an opposite idea of how to run an organization and seeks to dominate with one over the other, that does so over the labor and through the exploitation of the working class that produce the very commodities itself in which these bourgeois figures are able to profit from. We must fight against Cuba and must destroy any forms of way in which the working class or any kind of private capitalist firm or any capitalist system is able to dominate over the working class as well as able to institute itself. Because the problem with Cuba right now is indeed the problem of capitalism, and also with U.S. imperialism mingling with it being used in order to beat out competition within the world, and is thus essentially oppressing the Cuban proletariat, and thus forcing Cuba entirely and Cuban immigrants to have to immigrate to the United States, where they face various problems and various discrimination within the country as well. That is one thing you have to understand here, and that is one thing that we have to understand. And that is the effort of us socialists today and what we must fight for. And the entire fight for socialism still continues onto Cuba and into the efforts to doing so. The fight in Cuba entirely is a fight for socialism, actually, and not the fight entirely for the United States a model of government, like the conservative lies like to say, but rather actually a fight entirely against U.S. imperialism and against U.S. influence, but also for an actual socialist revolution, or at least that's what it should be. And this is what us communists have to fight for today, and what we must do as well. And this is entirely what we have to understand in Cuba at the time, that the problems with Cuba and the problems that have historically happened have always been the problems of capitalism, and it's not had gone away since. And this is around the time where the working class must see that these problems are capitalism, and must actually see that these can actually, yes, can indeed go back to, well, the Spanish-American War that essentially allowed America to essentially increase capitalist domination entirely, and thus must abolish the market and must abolish commodity production entirely. Through this effort, we can see a society where it's based on the freedom of the humanity, and where we can actually see full utility production, and another based on the power of the individual themselves and their freely associated labor through the abolition of classes, money, and the state. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, then hit the like button down below. I very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it as well. Get this essentially channel a lot more accurate, a lot more vocalized, and as well as getting this channel to be more, what is the word, more known, and for this channel to be more known and be able to spread revolutionary theory and spread class and political consciousness to the proletariat. However, I am just one man. I think it is best to do this through a political organization entirely. But yeah, other than that, thank you for watching this video, and Socialist Lynx is out.